they welcome everyone to the second class in this series on how to live the compassionate life, the Bodhisattvas, Jewel Garland of Lama Atisha. Let's start last week we did a few more prayers. I think tonight we're just going to do the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. I think most of you are familiar with this. I like to do it the first time in English just to remind us of what the Tibetan words are. And then we'll do it twice in the Tibetan, chanting it. And again, forgive my chanting voice. It's not so good these days, but I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi pe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi pe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog. And let's do a short meditation, give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a little bit. First, just using the breath as a meditation object, trying to let go of whatever distractions we might have in our minds by bringing our awareness to the breath. And you can use whatever technique you prefer to use in regard to the breath. And then I will come in a few minutes and lead you in a short reflection on bodhicitta, which I talked about in the first class last week. But anyway, we'll kind of refresh that motivation for our time together. So we can begin with the breathing meditation now. So now to set our motivation of bodhicitta, we'll briefly review one of the two main techniques for generating this mind that I went through last week. We won't spend much time on each of these points. These are just a way of reminding us of, hopefully we've all had teachings on these topics, just to remind us of the content of these particular points. And we begin tonight with the kind of basis of equanimity that is important to have if we're going to ever generate the mind of bodhicitta that wants to benefit all beings. We have to see them all with an equal regard. To think about the fact that we currently have biases towards our friends in terms of having attachment, towards the strangers in terms of having a mind of indifference, and then certainly towards those who are difficult for us, the enemies, in terms of having a mind of aversion, anger, and so on. And recall that all these beings are fundamentally the same. They all want to be happy, don't want to suffer. They all continue to suffer and have not yet found the happiness they seek. So, whatever relationship we have with them now, whatever distorted attitudes we have, there's no real basis for them when we see all beings in that equal way. And on the basis of that, we go on to the 7-point cause and effect method, which begins with recalling that all beings have been our dear mothers, also been our dear fathers, brothers, sisters. We focus on the role of the mother because we can recall the kindness of our mothers in particular. This is the second step. Whether or not we felt that we experienced the full kindness of our mothers, we know that they did some things for us that allowed us to continue to have our lives, to be here right now. We depended upon their kindness, particularly at a time when we were quite vulnerable. And every being has been kind in that way, as our dear mother. And then we generate the wish to repay that kindness. And not to repay it in a more temporal way, but to repay it in an ultimate way, to want to help all beings to find the happiness that they seek and to be free from all suffering. And therefore, we go on to the next step, which is to generate the great love that looks upon sentient beings with affection, wanting to help them to have all the happiness that they seek. And then the great compassion that looks upon sentient beings with the concern for their suffering and wanting them to be free from all suffering, and moreover, to be the agent for accomplishing that for them. And then we strengthen those thoughts of great love and great compassion with the altruistic intention, the desire to do this, to actually make this reality, no matter what it takes, even if it is by ourselves alone. We will lead sentient beings out of suffering and lead them to the perfect happiness and bliss that is their birthright. And how will we accomplish that? That leads us to the final resultant mind, the 7th step, the mind of bodhicitta, the recognition that to do this for others, we have to become a Buddha ourselves. There's no other way we can accomplish the welfare of all beings unless we are in that state, able to know their minds perfectly, to know their karma, their predispositions, and to be able to teach them exactly in accord with that so they can accomplish Buddhahood, their full potential. So this is the mind of bodhicitta we want to bring to these teachings tonight, this Mahayana text on these various practices, these verses that spell out this garland of jewels that we can adorn ourselves with, the practices of a bodhisattva. We do this with the motivation to become a Buddha so we can benefit all beings perfectly. And then you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. Okay, so welcome back to the second class. Again, in the first class, we introduced the text a bit, the author, talked a bit about the context of it in terms of Lojong, mind training, as well as in the Lam Rim, where it fits into that structure. And so we went on to the very first verses. I think we made it through 4 verses last time. Again, there's the structure of this text isn't that concise compared to things like a Lam Rim text or what have you. There's just a lot of different verses that are setting things out, but the initial part of it really is about finding the optimal conditions for being able to cultivate the mind of bodhicitta, to kind of overcome those states of mind that are counterproductive to generating bodhicitta, that go against our ability to meditate well on that mind. This is one of the most important things we can do with this human life that we have. If we can at least cultivate some of the understanding of bodhicitta and begin to generate that in our hearts, that's an amazing accomplishment. I will remind everyone that, again, bodhicitta is at that third level of the stages of the path, but we want to have it informed by the previous teachings. The first level, where we looked at the teachings on karma and so on, we'll touch on those a little bit tonight. There's a verse coming up that deals with the subject of karma and the importance of being in charge of our next rebirth, making sure that we've created the causes to continue to have good rebirths. And then the middle scope, where we look at the bigger picture and the desire to attain the state of nirvana, to have peace once and for all, to no longer be under the control of the factors that keep us going from life to life in the cycle of existence. So those teachings do need to be practiced and studied well and even realized to some degree before engaging in bodhicitta. But nonetheless, we're going to kind of dive into this text with that motivation of bodhicitta and a desire to explore these kind of gems that the Bodhisattvas adorn themselves with, that Lama Atisha is setting out in this text. Okay, so let's go to verse 4ab. I didn't need to go to the slides necessarily because we're just going to go right to the text, but I can pull that up easily enough as well. I've got that on my screen. Again, I think Sheila did, or Pat, someone put something in the chat box around retrieving this text, but again, this is out there at Wisdom Publications website. Verse 4 says, "Forsake wealth and ministrations, at all times relinquish gain and fame." So we're just going to do the first 2 lines of that. What we see mentioned in here, wealth and ministrations. Ministrations are, people kind of taking care of us, honoring us, respecting us. These are worldly concerns, to have wealth in this life and to be thought well of by others and so on, to have that material gain and that fame that might come with having a good reputation and what have you. And so this really kind of does move into the territory of the topic that is taught in the Lam Rim frequently in the context of death and coming to have an acceptance of one's own death and recognizing how we can squander and waste this life, being preoccupied with what are called the 8 worldly concerns. So let me go back to the slides, and I put a little together on that. I won't go into great depth on these because hopefully this too is a topic that many of you have seen before. This is from Geshe Loden's Lam Rim book. "For your Dharma practice to be pure, it is necessary to have abandoned the comforts of this life, that is, to have renounced the 8 worldly dharmas." So these are a way of looking at things that we are attracted to and attached to getting in our lives, and also their opposites that we are attached to avoiding, in a sense. We, have a strong desire to not have those experiences. So we're going to look at them in terms of these pairs then. There are 4 pairs that constitute the 8 worldly dharmas. The first pair are the first 2 bullet points on the screen there, being pleased when receiving wealth. In other words, what we saw in our text, the wealth, the material gain that people in the desire realm very much like having, right? We want everything, all the various gadgets and money and everything that makes us feel good about all these things in our lives, the wealth that we have. Of course, we need some measure of wealth to be able to afford to keep this body alive and what have you, through eating food and so on, having a roof over our heads. But nonetheless, there's a strong attachment to gaining wealth. And then, of course, being displeased when we lose wealth. You just look at how our minds feel when we receive a check in the mail versus when we receive a bill in the mail. It's this, strong attachment to having more and to avoiding any diminishment of our resources. Of course, wealth can mean, money, but again, it can mean also all the other physical things that we have in our lives. The second pair is sometimes referred to as, being pleased when experiencing pleasure or displeased when experiencing misery. But another more frequent way of talking about this is comfort or discomfort. We have a strong attachment to everything needing to be very pleasing and comfortable in our lives. The way I illustrate this is the um, the fact that whenever you go flying, and I'm sure most of you have been on flights sometime in your life, and maybe even recently some flights, no one who's traveling alone ever reserves the middle seat, right? You never want that middle seat that's where you're kind of scrunched between two people. That's not a very comfortable place to be for, especially longer flights. If you're flying across the country or into doing an international flight, it's just not a desirable place to sit for that duration of time. So again, we have this strong attachment to avoiding that. We get very upset if we end up in a middle seat, if you for whatever reason get bumped into one of those or have to take one of those based on uh, whatever airline you're flying or what have you. But so again, that's just a small example of it, right? But this is what guides us throughout most of our day. We're looking for what is pleasant, comfortable, enjoyable, and we're trying to avoid anything that's uncomfortable, anything that doesn't make us feel good. So again, this is a big preoccupation, especially with the human beings in this world, though we can see how that even drives a lot of animals as well, trying to find what is comfortable and safe for them versus what has some element of danger or harm. The third pair, being pleased at being famous, having fame, being well thought of in the world, and being displeased at being in disrepute. So this is a big one for some people. Other people don't care as much about their reputation in the world, but nonetheless, we all like to be thought of well in terms of how we are perceived in our little community, whatever world that we are talking about, our neighborhood, our family, our workplace, whatever it is it might be. So and then the last pair are more about the individuals who interact with us in terms of whether we're praised or denigrated. Being pleased when we receive that praise, people saying good things about us, and then, of course, being displeased when people criticize us, put us down, what have you. So, again, these eight worldly dharmas are worth examining in regard to your own life and seeing to what extent are these guiding you. Again, if we go back to the verse was essentially talking about mainly the first two, which, again, if we go back, we see that that was the wealth and, avoiding any loss, as well as the last two, being praised, obtaining the praise and what have you. I'm sorry, the third set of two, being famous, having fame, not having a bad reputation and what have you. And again, praises can be in there as well, the ministrations that were mentioned in the verse. But again, we have to examine to what degree are we involved in those sorts of patterns, because that is actually the beginning of Dharma practice, is when we are able to set those things aside and actually be more preoccupied with greater goals. The goal of our next rebirth, the goal of being free from the samsara, the goal of attaining complete enlightenment. Those things are dependent upon us letting go of our preoccupation with these worldly concerns. So I'm going to just share a few more comments that this is actually from an interesting little text from one of the Kadam Geshes. Remember, I talked about the Kadampas, these followers of Lama Atisha's Lojong mind training teachings. This is Kadam Geshe Kara Gomchen. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche translated a very short text by him. And he talks in there about wealth versus being poor, not having material resources. If one is wealthy, there's the great suffering of collecting and protecting. This is the problem, right? When we have a lot of things, then we are totally preoccupied with getting them, maintaining them, protecting them from harm or being stolen, what have you. If one's a beggar, though, one is free of desire for this life, and the result is peace and happiness. There is inner wealth. So again, this is one of the emphases that we often see in Buddhism, is to simplify our lives in terms of the possessions we have. But remember that the eight worldly concerns aren't saying don't have these in your life. They're saying watch your mind of attachment to having them in your life. So if you have things in your life, fine, but don't be so attached to them. Don't think that you absolutely have to have those things and you'd get bent out of shape if you lost them. Rather, just they're things that we have during this period of time that we're here in this body. And when we die, we're going to have to leave it all behind anyway. But if we can live our lives a little simpler without so many things, there's a great freedom that comes with that. And then from another text that's in the mind training tradition by Tokme Sangpo, who wrote the really wonderful Tibetan text, The 37 Practices of a Bodhisattva. We'll see a couple of verses from him shortly. If I face poverty, so be it. In lack of riches, I'll rejoice. Because this is the attitude of a Kadampa practitioner. If I lose my resources or have nothing, well, then I'll rejoice. Why? Because I'll have nothing to protect and nothing to lose at that point. And whatever quarrels and conflicts there might be, all arise out of desire for wealth and gain. That's certain. I mean, look at how much preoccupation with things and acquiring things, especially wealth, that people have, and a lot of the fighting and conflict comes about because of that. Then he goes on to talk about the alternative. Okay, so if I face poverty, that's what's I can be perfectly fine with that. If I find wealth, so be it. In prosperity, I'll rejoice. If I can increase the stock of my merits, that will suffice. Whatever benefit and happiness there might be now and in the future, all result from merits I have gained. That's certain. So the idea here is that he's essentially saying that if you do have resources, well, count your blessings and that you have something you can do something good with, right? You can give money to people who are in need. You can offer it to your gurus, to the projects that they have. You can do all kinds of things with resources that you have and create merit. So if you can do that when you have wealth, and when you don't have wealth, you're kind of free from all of the stuff that causes difficulties and problems and conflict in the world. They're both a win situation. Poverty and wealth are both kind of positive if we look at them the right way. And of course, this is really back to the whole issue of mind training, what we were talking about throughout this text, as well as in this whole tradition of Lojong. We're trying to change our mind so that whatever we meet, we turn it into Dharma practice. If things are bad, well, then we turn it into an opportunity to find something good in there. If things are good, well, then we don't get too attached to the good. We try to use those good situations to our benefit in terms of future merit that we can create and ways we can benefit other beings and so on. So this is again just emphasizing that whole idea of mind training. So I think I can go back to the text now. I don't think I have any other slides to share on that. And let's go to verse 5. Cultivate love and compassion and oops, I didn't do the rest of verse 4. Sorry. Last two lines of verse 4. Have modest desires, be easily satisfied, and reciprocate kindness. So it's kind of interesting, this third line there, that have modest desires to be easily satisfied. That's kind of one of the antidotes to working with the eight worldly concerns, is to not have so many things that we desire and want, and to be satisfied with what we have. In other words, to have contentment. And then, of course, this last one, reciprocate kindness, is we could give a whole weekend of teachings on reciprocating kindness. There are many ways that we can do that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of how we can see sentient beings as being kind to us and therefore reciprocating their kindness. But this idea of the third line there in that verse 4, have modest desires, be easily satisfied. Um, Again, this is a great wealth, they say, if we have contentment. I'm going to share a little quote from Nagarjuna. I think this is from his letter to a friend. In his friendly letter, Nagarjuna said, if you have contentment, then even though you may be robbed of everything, consider yourself the richest person. But should you lack contentment, then no matter how rich you may be, you are a servant of your wealth. So again, contentment is an amazing gift that we can have, and no one can take it away from us, right? No one can rob you of your contentment. That would be the greatest riches that you could possess, is contentment. And then, if you don't have that contentment, then no matter how much you have in resources, how rich you might be, you become a servant of your wealth. So again, this is a nice advice from Nagarjuna, the benefits of the mind of contentment. To talk a little bit about the last line about the kindness, reciprocating kindness, I want to refer this back to one of the slogans. Remember, I mentioned last week this wonderful text in the mind training tradition that Geshe Chikawa composed, the 7-point mind training. And this is under the second point, I believe, around cultivating bodhicitta. Meditate on the great kindness of all beings. That's the translation that was in this uh, text that is cited on the screen there. But the idea behind this is that we can see certainly the ways that some sentient beings are quite directly and even intentionally kind to us, right? We look at our friends, the people who care for us, who buy us gifts occasionally or take us here and there when we need an errand or whatever the case might be. There are a lot of people who are in that role who are quite directly and intentionally kind. And that's what we normally refer to as kindness in our world. If I use the Western kind of way of approaching it, that's what kindness looks like, is when people do things for other people or for other beings, what have you. But in Buddhism, we try to expand this idea of what is kindness, at least when we're talking about it on the receiving end. There, when that phrase from Geshe Chikawa is meditate on the great kindness of all beings. Well, how are beings who don't even know us being kind to us? Well, that comes down to them playing a behind the scenes role in terms of our welfare. They're not directly or intentionally kind to us, but we benefit from what they do. Kindness is going to be redefined when we talk about it in this context as us benefiting from what other beings do. And this became very evident. I think all of you would agree when we had the pandemic, right? 5 years ago, when we were dealing with the change in everything, so many of us being kind of quarantined at home, not wanting to make it worse on our healthcare workers with all the cases that were happening, especially there in New York, right? It was so horrible when you think about what was going on 5 years ago. And so there were still people, obviously, who were tending to a lot of the things that we needed. So there was still food around, maybe at times some food shortages and toilet paper shortages or whatever the case might be. But there was in general all these beings, these human beings generally, although there are other sentient beings involved sometimes in producing things, they kept doing what they were doing so that we could have the food that was grown and then harvested and then shipped and packaged and even prepared for us at times. All of that still kept happening for us. And of course, all the things that were needed for us to have electricity in our homes, for us to be able to have gas to put in our tanks when we were driving our cars or whatever. All these various things happened due to the kindness of others. Now, they didn't intentionally be kind to us in that way. While they were growing stuff, they didn't say, "Oh, I can't wait till Don eats this, head of lettuce or whatever." That's not what they were thinking, right? It wasn't that type of kindness, but they were doing what they did for our benefit. And so again, we can see that this is happening all the time. It's not just during the pandemic that beings are doing this for us. It's always going on. We are dependent upon the kindness of other beings in that way. So that's the kind of larger group of the strangers that are kind of behind the scenes, all these beings that we don't know that are playing roles in terms of helping us to have what brings us some measure of comfort, happiness. We can even see the kindness of difficult people for us, though. And this is the most challenging because they are doing the opposite of what society calls kind, right? They are being intentionally and directly, or some maybe not always intentionally, but certainly directly unkind to us. They are doing things, saying things to us or those that we love who, with some malicious intent, with something that is not very wholesome, right? How can we see that as a kindness? We can see that as a kindness because they are giving us the perfect opportunity to deepen our own practice of loving kindness, compassion, patience, and so on. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often points out how we absolutely need those difficult people in our lives in terms of our practice. If we only had kind of the strangers and very good friends and everything in our lives all the times, and everybody treated us relatively well, we never had any conflict with anybody, and so on, how would we learn patience? How would we learn to expand our hearts beyond that more immediate circle? So, this is an important aspect in terms of realizing even the kindness that we can see in terms of the benefit that we can accrue from having those difficult people in our lives. So going back to Geshe Chikawa's line, meditate on the great kindness of all beings. Well, that's one approach to be able to see that any being that we encounter, whether they're in the first category of friends, the second category of strangers, or the last category of enemies, difficult people, they all are showing us some measure of kindness if we choose to see it that way. The last one in particular does take a little more challenge, to kind of get our heads around how can I see this as something beneficial for me. But nonetheless, if we work with it, we will see that that's the reality. Um, there are many other ways you can reflect on the great kindness of all beings, just, like we said earlier, and in the meditation I led tonight, them all having been your mother. In that way, they have all shown you incredible kindness when they were somebody very dear to you, who supported you, took care of you at that very vulnerable stage of life. So again, this is an important thing to meditate on, is to recognize the incredible kindness that we experience from the variety of beings who are around us, and to wish to reciprocate that. And as I was saying in the meditation tonight, when we meditated on that 7-point cause and effect, our reciprocation should go beyond just doing something that's more temporal for them. We should want to do something that actually helps them in a deeper way. And that leads us kind of nicely into the first two lines of verse 5. Cultivate
Excuse me,
love
Don.
and
Can you
compassion.
make that the text a little bigger?
Oh, here we go. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I
Thank you.
forgot to do that last week too.
That's good.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for reminding me of that. Cultivate love and compassion and stabilize your awakening mind. So, again, I'm not going to comment so much on this because these are things we talked about last week and they'll come up throughout this course. Love and compassion are really the root of bodhicitta, which is called here the awakening mind. These are the things that we need to do continually. Our love and compassion isn't just a single thought that we have, or a single meditation. Every day we should practice having loving kindness for other beings, wishing to place them in happiness, and then having the companion thought of compassion that wants to protect them from suffering. So again, every being that we meet, we should have those as part of our thoughts towards them when we're seeing them. Remember Richard Gere, when he was he was interviewed as part of the Discovering Buddhism series of videos. He was talking about how he tried to practice for a while this transformation of his thoughts whenever he met a being. Instead of his judging mind, which we all have, right, when we meet somebody, who is this person? What do they want from us? Are they worth our time? Blah, 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 blah. Instead of all of that, he just had this thought, may you be happy, which of course is one of those thoughts of loving kindness, metta meditation. It's important to kind of reframe every being that we meet through that lens of loving kindness and compassion, and then to feed that into our bodhicitta motivation to say, yes, and I want to benefit those beings. Every being I meet is an object of my bodhicitta. I depend upon every being that I meet in terms of being able to cultivate my own enlightenment. We cannot get enlightened without all other beings being involved. So I'm not going to talk much more about that. I think this verse is pretty, those two lines are pretty evident from all of the work we've done already, even last week going over the techniques for generating bodhicitta, because we saw in both of them love and compassion are the roots, especially compassion. But those two companion thoughts are very important to continually generate and to work as much as we can to stabilize our bodhicitta, to have that be our default mind. The last two lines of verse 5 kind of jump to a whole nother topic, but there is a correlation to some degree because we want to engage in this practice of relinquishing the 10 non virtues, or 10 negative actions, and reinforcing our faith in karma. This is the two lines that speak to kind of earlier teachings that are in the Lam Rim, but are so important in terms of understanding the mechanism by which we achieve any results. When we go back to those three levels of the Lam Rim, karma is taught in the first one because it is the main means by which we can have an effect on our future lives. If we don't avoid the 10 non virtues, we will only create the causes for unfortunate rebirths. These are going again the teachings that are given in that stage of uh, the Lam Rim, and so it's important that we understand it there in terms of that first one. But the other two also have the element of karma, because karma simply is the law of cause and effect. It is referring to the fact that any actions we engage in produce the seed that eventually gives rise to the result that is in the same vein as that particular seed. We'll talk about that in a moment in terms of these general principles of karma. But what are being referred to here in this line, the 5C, the line that I read on the 10 avoiding the 10 non-virtues, 10 negative actions, are what are called these 10 that are identified by the Buddha that are really important in terms of avoiding as much as possible. They don't cover everything that is non-virtuous, but it's like the lion's share of what is non-virtuous that beings like ourselves engage in frequently. So I'm not going to go into huge detail on this, but nonetheless, I do want to spend a little time on it. I will mention that there is a little booklet that the FPMT has, and I'm going to forward this on to Sheila and Pat, and they will get this to everyone like they got you the handout from last week. It's called The 10 Non-Virtues and Their Results, a convenient outline for quick reference. But essentially, it goes into the 10 non-virtues, kind of describing them and giving the mechanics of them, these four components that have to be present for them to be complete, and then talks about each of them, killing and so on. I'm not going to go through all of this right now because, again, it's just way too much to cover in a single evening like this. When I teach on karma, I'm usually doing like an entire 5, 6 sessions on karma because you need at least that much time to go into the detail. And karma is a difficult teaching for us, but we have to gain, some faith, some conviction in it. So let's go back to the slides, and I'm just going to review these very briefly in terms of these 10. The 10 non-virtuous actions, again, you can refer to that handout that I just had on the screen. They are divided into 3 sets. The first set are the 3 actions of body. These are physical actions that we engage in, and they are set out in terms of the most serious is the first, least the second, and then the third being the least serious of these in general in terms of the heaviness of those, though circumstances could make them obviously more harmful or less harmful in certain situations. The first one is killing, taking the life of another being. The second one is stealing, where we take the possessions of another that have not been offered to us. And then the third one is, I call it unwise sexual behavior. They sometimes use the term sexual misconduct. The idea here is that we are sexual beings, and those of us who are lay practitioners who have not made a vow to avoid sexual behavior entirely, we have to be wise about our sexual behavior, not engaging in adultery, which would be harmful to our partners if we are in a committed relationship, or to someone else's partner if the person that we are engaging in sexual activity with is in a committed relationship. Certainly not using our sexual behavior in coercive um, ways that would be abusive to another person. We know that's extremely harmful to that person and even harms ourselves and greatly. So these 3, are things that we do bodily that can all be avoided. And if we avoid them, of course, we create the positive karma of refraining from those actions, relinquishing those actions. Moreover, though, in the Mahayana path, we want to also try to think about protecting the lives of others rather than just not killing. I mean, if we can go a little further than that on the path, and then, of course, not just not stealing people's possessions or other beings' possessions, but also protecting their possessions and even being generous with our own possessions, our own resources. And then the third one, instead of just refraining from unwise sexual behavior, to really encourage healthy sexual relationships with our own partners as well as with that we see in others, to make sure people value some of the things that are really the the main elements of having a good sexual relationship with another. So again, on all of these, we can see that not doing them is already virtuous, but then going a little further can become even more virtuous. The next 4 pertain to those that we do with our speech. And these also are set out in general as the lying being the most serious and meaningless speech being the least heavy of these 4. But again, they can get weightier depending upon what we're doing. Lying, purposefully telling the non-truth to another person through our speech or through any way that we communicate with others. You can lie through text. You can commit any of these through text, essentially, or through emails or through smoke signals or whatever way that you communicate. But mainly we're focusing on how we use our physical speech. And so lying, deceiving others with the words that we say is obviously a heavy action. Can lead to lots of confusion in others and them perhaps even harming others or doing things on the basis of lies that we've told them. The next one, number 5, divisive or divisive speech. This is where we try to break up people who are having a harmonious relationship, or where there is already some division, we try to divide them further. Obviously, this goes on in our world a lot, and when we look at politically what's happening, there's a lot of divisive speech out there. So we have to watch how we use our speech to separate people. The next one, number 6, harsh speech, is when we use our speech to harm people by saying cutting, harsh words to them. And then meaningless speech, where we just kind of, as Venerable Rabina would say, rabbit on, just say all kinds of things that are really meaningless and not really very purposeful. And we just waste our own time and waste other people's time. It's the least of the 4 because we engage in it much more frequently, but it can become very powerful, obviously, if we do it to an extreme degree and what have you, and kind of, again, waste the good share of our lives in doing that. In general, the 4 of speech are less heavy than the 3 of body. To harm the bodies or through our physical bodies, do things, that is a heavier action than doing things with our speech. But I do want to caution people, we are going to see a couple things around speech here. We even saw a bit of that earlier, in terms of how we need to praise other people's qualities and so on. I mean, all these ways that we can use our speech in so many beneficial ways. Again, not lying, not dividing people with speech, and so on. These are all important to avoid. But what is it like to really uphold the truth in our world, to make sure that before we say something to somebody else, that we know that that is true? Because there's a lot of that going around, right? Where people just hear something and they immediately start telling other people that without really checking up to see, was that really true? Is this really what transpired or what this person said before I start sharing it all over? What is it like to not just avoid divisive speech, but to actually speak harmoniously and try to bring people together, to heal the divides by bridging across the differences that we have with other people? So again, we can see in all of these, for the Bodhisattva ethic, we're trying to do these all with a greater aim of trying to benefit beings, not just stop harming them, which is a good place to start. Don't harm them. His Holiness often says that, right? It is really best if we can benefit other beings, but if we can't benefit them, at least don't harm them. And that's kind of what our ethics comes down to. So we want to aim for the greatest possible benefit by helping others to have greater things, greater benefit in their lives. But if we can't do that, then at least don't harm them. At least don't lie to them and cut them down with our speech and so on. The last 3 lead to actions that we might engage in regard to others, but they are really just mental patterns that we have. And these are actually set out in the reverse order. So the last one is the most serious, and the number 8 there, covetousness, is the least. Covetousness is when we are desiring the objects of another that others possess. And we, of course, generate the initial thought of admiring that and beginning to think we want it to be ours. When you get to the end of it, where you really think that you want to acquire that object, that's when that becomes a full action. It's still just mental, but it can obviously lead us sometimes to steal from others. We might even gain some things through honest means, but nonetheless, that desirous mind is a real problem in our world. Number 9, harmful intent. This is where we wish to harm others. We have initially been slighted by them or have a bad feeling about them, and it just increases until we get to a place where we decide we are going to harm that being. Whether or not we actually do it through stealing from them or hitting them or whatever the case might be, damaging their property, what have you. It doesn't matter if we do the action. The mind is creating this wish to harm others, and once it becomes that full-fledged wish to do that, then that action is complete. And then number 10, wrong view. Wrong view is set here because obviously this is a Buddhist presentation, and if we have particularly the wrong view that karma doesn't exist, that this mechanism by which we have the actions we engage in bringing forth results that are commensurate with that, in line with that, well, then we don't have any ramifications to our actions. Avoid and kind of decrying the law of karma, law of cause and effect, is going to lead down a very unpleasant path, because we will continue to create negative actions thinking there are no consequences to these things that we do. That's the main wrong view that is set out here, though obviously there are other ways we can have wrong views by holding some things that the Buddha taught to not exist, and then some things that the Buddha said didn't exist, we hold them actually to exist. So there's a lot of different wrong views that are mentioned there. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail, but know that every one of those has kind of 4 components that make it complete. They have a basis, an object that we are involved in, the state of mind, the intention that is involved at that time and has different components to it, the initiating of the action, and then the completion of the action. So all of these need to be there for it to be a complete action. Once it becomes a complete action, then it's a seed planted in our minds that can give rise to a future existence. An unfavorable existence if it was a negative karma, and then, of course, a favorable existence if we've done something positive and virtuous. So it's really important that we study this, that we engage in topics or classes that go into the detail about this topic of karma, because otherwise we will not have the right information that we're working with. I do want to touch on these 4 because these are the initial teaching on karma that are given, and I just am going to explain them very, very briefly, but they are important to understand the general workings of karma. The first one is the certainty of karma. And by that word certainty, we mean that if you plant a non virtuous, a negative action in your mind through having completed it, or even through parts of it that you have done, you are certain to experience the fruit of that negative action in terms of it being suffering. Suffering is what arises from non virtue. Right? And negative actions bring forth that result. On the other hand, if you plant a seed that is positive, that is virtuous, then you will experience happiness down the road from that. That is certain. So we're not talking about the certainty of getting the result, but the result being certain. It's certain that suffering arises from what is non virtuous, and it's certain that happiness arises from what is virtuous. This is the way it works in nature. We see that you get from an apple seed, an apple tree, and from an avocado seed, an avocado tree, right? It doesn't cross and you plant a little apple seed and suddenly you've got an avocado tree growing there, right? It doesn't happen that way in nature. Karma is a subset of the law of nature, law of cause and effect that we see in nature, and so on. And so it has rules that are similar. Whatever we plant, something commensurate will come down the way. Unhappiness, suffering arising from what is non virtuous, and then happiness, pleasure arising from what is virtuous. The second one has to do with the fact that karma increases. It's the increase of karma, multiplication of karma, in a similar way to when you do plant that apple seed. From a tiny apple seed, you can get an apple tree, and then, of course, bushels of apples year after year after year. There's an increase in terms of what comes about from that tiny little apple seed. Well, in nature, that's how it works, and there are many other factors that contribute to it. When we talk about karma, just merely planting the seed in our mental continuum, by its very nature, it will increase and grow. As long as it's left untended, it will produce results that are way beyond what we actually did initially. That's why, again, in our culture, we don't have a very good understanding of karma. I see this in some of these weird reality shows or whatever, where people say, oh, they're getting their karma from what they did to this other person. Well, that's not how karma works, is that it's like a tit for tat sort of thing. You lied to that person there, and then you get lied to over here. It can be much greater, the result, than what you did initially, because karma increases every day. It becomes larger and larger and larger. That's the reason why, particularly with negative karma, we have to have a purification practice, which I won't go into as part of this, but I'm sure there are many teachings out there on how to have a full purification through what are called the 4 opponent powers, so that every day we can tend to our karma and pull out those seeds that we planted that were non-virtuous so they don't increase. And of course, leave the ones that are positive there and not do anything harmful to them, such as having a mind of anger and so on. Number 3, actions not done do not bring results. And number 4, actions done are not wasted. These are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. Actions we don't do, well, we're not going to get the results of. Okay, so if you don't kill, then you don't get the results of killing. If you do kill, if you are killing, taking the lives of beings, then those actions will be embedded in our minds and eventually bring forth their results. They aren't wasted. Again, the kind of sub or footnote on that one is that if you do interrupt the continuity of that seed, then you won't experience the result. That's what I was talking about earlier through purification. If you purify the non-virtuous actions, then you may not experience the full result of that. You might have a lesser result or you might have no result of it. On the other hand, if you do something to harm the virtuous seeds you planted, you may not get the full impact of that virtuous action either. And as I said, that's like having a very heavy mind of anger or wrong view or what have you, these mental states that diminish the power of the positive karma that we've created. So numbers 3 and 4 are really this idea of if you don't do it, you don't get the result. And if you do it, you do get the result unless it's interrupted, unless something comes about that will keep it from bringing forth its result. So it's very important that we study well. That last line of the verse said, always reinforce your faith in the law of karma. You know, so this is what we're speaking to in terms of Geshe Nawandarge's commentary on the book that I mentioned last week, Advice from a Spiritual Friend. Furthermore, Atisha advises us to stabilize our faith and confidence, and particularly in the law of karma here. In the Buddhist context, faith does not arise from fear, but is based on reason. Confidence in the teachings arises when we experience for ourselves how non deceptive they are. It is said that such conviction is the mother of firm understanding. So, faith, this word faith is used in Buddhism, but faith is not a blind faith. Now, when it comes to karma, there are elements of it that are impossible for us to see completely, right? And I always joke that if you were getting ready to step on an insect or something and a huge foot was coming down out of the sky to smash you, you'd get it right away. But karma doesn't work that way, right? We do an action and we don't see the results of it until further down the road. Many of the actions we commit don't ripen until our next life or even beyond that into future lives. Some actions we do ripen within this life, but nonetheless, that can't be proved. I cannot prove karma to anyone. In fact, it's said that to really understand the subtle workings of karma and why particular things ripen into certain situations for beings, you have to have the mind of a Buddha. You have to be able to see the complexity of all this. Because karma, again, isn't this linear process, it's a very dynamic process where the karma is growing all the time. Different causes and conditions are playing a role in terms of when that ripens, how it ripens, and so on. So don't think that it's this kind of static thing that, from point A to point B, when you experience the result, that suddenly, it's just this very predictable, complete thing that we can know very definitely. We can't really know except in a kind of general way what is going on through these teachings that are given to us by the kindness of the Buddha in terms of how to understand the mechanism of karma. But the actual specific workings cannot really be proved. Nonetheless, if we do study karma well and we meditate to some degree on it, it makes a lot of sense. Oftentimes, when I teach on karma, I compare it to other traditions and what they say about why things happen to beings. And there, they might be mainly concerned about people, human beings, but nonetheless, what is their explanation for why things happen to beings? In some of the theistic traditions, it has to do with a creator God who is kind of the puppeteer over all of us puppets, and they're all the actions, the things that we experience are a product of that creator God's mind or wishes or whatever. I mean, that's at least the way I was presented it when I grew up Roman Catholic, but didn't really have a lot of confidence in this type of a being, kind of being behind the scenes, pulling all the strings. There are other people who might propound that it's all purely chance, random, that there's really no way that anything has any kind of logic or cause and effect type process. It all just happens on its own from whatever other things are going on. Of course, if we had that view, that might lead to not being able to do anything to affect any result that we're getting, because if that is, it's always up to chance, well, then we never know what we're going to get. We might do something in one case and not get a result at all, and then the other time we do it, we get a different result or something. So again, this is when I look at these other traditions, I don't find a satisfactory explanation. With karma, it's saying you are in the driver's seat and you are making the decisions about what you're going to experience. And if you tend to this, you will generally see that over time, you have better results in your life. But even if we don't take that into consideration, you will probably feel better as a person in the world if you are avoiding these non-virtuous actions. If you stop killing other beings, stop stealing from them, stop lying to them, stop, you know, having meaningless, talks all night with them, whatever. All these things, when you begin to shut those doors, you feel better as a person because you're not engaged in these things that cause harm and chaos and disruption in the world around you. So there is some proof in the pudding right there. Venerable Rabina, when she approaches the topic of karma, she says, treat it like a working hypothesis, just like a scientist, right? This is what I'm going to do and see if I get the results that I would hope to get on the basis of this hypothesis. The hypothesis says, do these things, you'll suffer, do these things, you'll have happiness. See what happens when you avoid these things and engage in these things. It's to some degree not entirely provable, but it's a way of living one's life to actually say, I'm going to put this structure of karma on my life and see how I feel about it myself, as well as what are the general results I see in my life. You'll probably start having more harmony with the people around you and less conflict because you're not creating the causes of that in your everyday life. You're not yelling at them or, again, stealing from them or sleeping behind their back with someone else or whatever the case might be. So again, that's all I'm going to say about karma. It's a huge topic and one that's not easy to answer questions on because it is a very difficult thing. We have to generate our faith in it on the basis of what we can ascertain and explore. In terms of faith, I will mention that there are three types of faith that are mentioned in Buddhism, and none of these are blind faith. The first one probably comes closest. It's a clear faith or an admiring faith, but it involves investigating things, like, for example, with regard to karma, doing the detailed investigation through the Lam Rim of all the various things, the 10 non virtues, their four components, all the various things that support your understanding of karma. And you begin to gain some clarity around that and admire it to some degree in terms of something that you begin to see some esteem for as a system that the Buddha explained as to how things are working. The Buddha didn't create it, the Buddha simply was an observer of it. Third or second, the aspiring faith, where we long or aspire to practice in the way that the teachings on karma are telling us. So we begin moving in that direction. This is kind of the more active level of faith. And then the convinced faith or faith of conviction comes about when we have a greater confidence in the teachings on karma because we've begun to see the results for ourselves. Like I said, the working hypothesis has begun to show us the results that we were promised by abiding in the law of karma. So I just wanted to mention that really briefly. I don't want to spend tons of time on faith, but nonetheless, it is an important element of Buddhism, although once more, it's not a blind faith at all. And most topics that the Buddha taught can be engaged in a very uh, logical and analytical way, and the truth of them can be seen for oneself. The logic of karma is there by I have to admit that, yeah, there is a logical way that it works. Those four things that I went through spell out the logic. Do good things, get good results. Do bad things, get bad results, and so on. All that really does spell out how karma works, and it does make some sense. But to really gain genuine conviction in karma does take a little bit more kind of working with it and get beyond just the what we certainly can't see directly to understand that there is this mechanism working kind of behind the scenes to create the results experiences that we have in our lives. So that was what verse 5 was about. Again, it had a couple of different points in it, but another little nugget, another little gem that the Buddha Bodhisattvas practice, again, with that greater motivation of benefiting other beings. Number 6, let's look at the first two lines. Destroy anger and conceit and be endowed with humility. Of course, anger and conceit are not very pleasant things to be encountering in others. And so we don't want to be doing that for them. Alex Berzin, when he teaches on these, he talks about, kind of gives a little headline for each of these. For this one, it's avoiding pushing others away from when wishing to be helpful. If we want to be helpful to others, well, then the minds of anger and conceit are going to be problematic, right? to get angry and upset at those beings around us that we are trying to help, wanting to help. Well, what good is that going to do? It's only going to create more division between ourselves and others and not help us to be kind of on the good side of other beings. There's going to be some mention of self-importance, pride, a little bit later in the text. But pride, conceit, is said to be one of the main obstacles, because if we hold ourselves to be superior to others, how can we actually want to be in a position where we're going to benefit them? If we think that we are much better than others, well, then there's something missing there. How do we actually hold others to be most important and overcome those patterns of self-centeredness that I was referring to last week, that are overcome in the technique of equalizing and exchanging self and others when we generate bodhicitta? If everything becomes all about ourselves and how we see ourselves as better than others, the mind of anger that sees ourselves in terms of our own needs being more important than others, and so we can get angry and upset when others don't comply with our wishes. I mean, this becomes problematic for our relationships with other beings. If we're going to be a bodhisattva, we're going to practice the Mahayana path and want to benefit all beings, well, then these minds are problematic. The second part of this, that second line in verse 6 said, and be endowed with humility. Obviously, humility is the opposite of our mind of conceit or pride, but it also is there in terms of combating our anger. Once more, our anger is often revolving around that me being right, me being the one that's more important, and forget everyone else. And so we think that we're superior to others in that way. The mind of humility is very important to practice. It allows us to be in a position where we are constantly seeing others as teachers for us. This is going to come up in a verse, hopefully I'll get to it later tonight, where we ideally want to see others as playing this very important role in helping us to see our faults, to see the things we need to work on. Rather than us putting them down and finding their faults and getting angry and upset at them, we're going to be more humble and put ourselves in that lower position. In the Tibetan teachings, of course, Tibet is a huge high plateau, right? And you have the mountains that kind of surround it, the Himalayas on the one side in particular that are really quite high. And then you have these very lush, beautiful valleys. I traveled in Tibet in 1994, and it was quite amazing. Some of these areas are really just green and lush and what have you. In Tibet, they use this phrase that you don't want to be like the mountaintop, you want to be like the valleys. And that's the idea that if you are thinking of yourself as superior, you're going to be in a place where nothing grows. That you won't be able to develop any new skills or abilities or understanding because you're going to see yourself as superior to everyone else, like you're on the mountaintop. If you hang out down in the valleys, though, that's where all the growth happens. All of the water, of course, descends down, makes those areas lush and green and what have you. That's how we actually grow ourselves most, is when we are humble, when we are looking at others as, what can I learn from this being? How can I improve my qualities by my interactions with them and so on? Rather than feeling superior, like I've got all this stuff going on for me and they're all, lacking and what have you. So again, these are just a few comments on those lines that I think are really quite important. Avoiding these negative patterns that cause conflict with others and make them feel bad. If we really want to help them, why would we have anger and conceit? But then really to see the benefits of being more humble and to not think that our needs are so important, but really to be with others from that space of humility. Oh, I may mention before we go on to the next part, there's that wonderful verse number 2 from the 8 verses. Verse number 2 says, when in the company of others, I shall always consider myself the lowest among all and respectfully hold others dear and supreme from the depths of my heart. That's a tough one, right? When we hear that lowest of all, our ego kind of goes, what? What are you talking about? We want to have that humble attitude because once more, that's how we will ultimately benefit ourselves to the best degree. But at that time, we can also then benefit others. We can think about, well, what do they need? Our whole organization is based on the concept of being of service to others. The FPMT, in its initial handbook that I got when I started teaching some 20 years ago, the very first page was Lama Zopa Rinpoche saying the entire reason why the FPMT exists is to serve sentient beings. That's how we should live our lives, is from that place of humility. Like, it is my job to serve others, to help others in whatever ways that I can, and certainly to help them in the long run by becoming a Buddha for their sake, being able to benefit them, at that level. Let's go on to the last two lines of verse 6. This one, there's a bit more to say on: relinquish wrong livelihood and be sustained by ethical livelihood. In the Tibetan tradition, they often talk about kind of five means of wrong livelihood, but there's more to it than that, because if we go back to some of the Pali scriptures, and even I'm going to cite a little bit from a book by Bhante Hanapala Gunaratana. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but he's a Theravadan monk who has a wonderful book called Eight Mindful Steps to Happiness, where he goes into right livelihood. Right livelihood is one of what are called the Eightfold Noble Path. When the Buddha initially taught the Four Noble Truths, that was included in there. But again, for the Bodhisattva, you're engaging in, once more, these same practices that are really foundational: having good livelihood, avoiding anything that is unethical. We want to do that because we don't want to be complicit in the harm to other beings. We don't want to be doing things in the long term that are going to be detrimental to ourselves or to them. So this is the concept behind it, is that we can see it as not just for our own benefit, but certainly for the benefit of others, so that they aren't being deceived or in other ways harmed. The more traditional way in Tibetan Buddhism, where we sometimes talk about wrong means of livelihood, are these five: flattery, where we say good things about somebody in order to receive something from them. We could be making those things up, or we could be exaggerating them so that they feel better about themselves, and then they are happy to share their resources or whatever with us. Coercion, where we force others to do things that will be of benefit to us, or give us the resources that we want from them. Hinting, saying things like, "Oh, when you gave me that, $500 last year, that was so helpful, and I used it in so many wonderful ways. It's always so useful to get that kind of money, blah, 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 blah." You keep hinting. You don't come right out and ask for another $500. You just keep saying things that make the person feel like, oh, I get the message. They would really like to get another $500 because it was so useful the last time, or what have you. So, sorry, drop something here. The fourth one is bribery, where we actually give somebody something small to, like, coerce them into doing something greater for us. And then the last one is hypocrisy. Maybe this is in many ways one of the worst ones, where we actually pretend to be better than we are. So maybe you have somebody who knows that you're a Buddhist practitioner, and perhaps you've left behind some of the working world and you need resources, and somebody might be tending to you and helping you out. Every time that you talk to them, you pretend to be a greater practitioner than you actually are. Oh yeah, I meditate 10 hours a day or something, and you're lucky if you did meditate 10 minutes a day. So so this is what, we know hypocrisy well. It's saying that you're better than you are for the benefit of resources in this case. um, the other things I want to say, again, have more to do with the general advice that's given by Bhante Hanapala Gunaratana in his book. He says you can determine whether a job is suitable to be skillful livelihood by asking yourself three interrelated questions. First, is my job an inherently wrong occupation? In other words, is there something about it that is not good to be engaged in? And for that, I'm going back to the Pali Canon, the Vanija Sutta. I cited that on the internet where I got this from. In the sutta, the Buddha says, monks, a lay follower should not engage in five types of business. Which five? Business in weapons, business in living beings, selling or procuring beings, what have you. Business in meat, the flesh of those beings. Business in intoxicants, and business in poison. These are the five types of business that a lay follower should not engage in. And we don't talk about this in Tibetan Buddhism so much, but it is kind of important that we not be complicit in the harm to other beings by what we do for money. Now, can we be completely removed from the harm of other beings by what we do? Impossible, right? I go up to Taos this part of the year. I go up every Thursday. I've got my last visit up there in 2 days for a while, because Geshe Sharab is back and he'll be teaching up there on Thursdays. But when I go up there, when the weather gets warmer, right, which it has been for the last couple of weeks here, I'm like smushing all kinds of bugs on my windshield just by going through the traffic, right? Driving up there at a speed of 65 miles an hour in parts and what have you. So it's impossible for me to not be involved in some harm to beings just by going to give a Dharma teaching. So we can't expect, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche was very clear in this with many of his teachings, you cannot live a life in this human world without being complicit in the harm to beings to some degree. Even if you become vegan, like I don't even eat the byproducts of animals, any of that, well, you're still involved in the harm to some beings because of the vegetables that you eat and so on, all these various things, the shipping of those things, again, cars smushing bugs and what have you. So it's impossible to not have some harm, but you don't want the business that you are engaged in to be directly involved in producing things that are harmful to beings through poison, weapons, and so on, all these various things, right? It makes sense. And again, I don't know why we don't talk about it so much in Tibetan Buddhism, because I think it is important that people not have those as an occupation, those various businesses. Second, does my job lead me to break the five moral precepts? We all know these five. These are the five lay vows that are given oftentimes when we take refuge with a preceptor. Just go through them very briefly. We've touched on them already to some degree, at least the first four. The first three are the three of body. You don't want to kill another being. That's the vow you take: to not kill, to not steal, and then to not have inappropriate sexual relations, which again would be adultery mainly, though obviously any other coerced sexual behavior. The fourth one is to not lie. And then the fifth one is to avoid alcohol and intoxicants. You mentioned, remember, the Buddha did mention producing intoxicants, or even if you were like a bartender and you're giving intoxicants to people all the time, that's how you make your money. Intoxicants themselves are not a naturally negative deed. They're not a misdeed in that way. They become the doorway through which misdeeds occur, though, right? People have a couple of drinks and then they're sleeping with somebody else's partner, or they have a couple of drinks and they're doing all kinds of things that could be harmful to other beings or to themselves. So this is the why that is tacked on. But again, some people may, for their jobs, have to go out and wine and dine people a lot, right? And overindulge in alcohol because they need to do that to kind of get the deals, the contracts that they are seeking from those people. You might need to lie in some businesses. I remember Venerable Amy, when she was still a lay person, she was working in Washington, D.C. She talked about this in her video for the Discovering Buddhism, the one on karma, how she was even being rewarded for how well she lied to people, because deceiving people was a part of the job. And that happens in a lot of different businesses, right? Where suddenly you're having to do things that are against the truth because that's required of you. So again, you can have to examine your own job, but does it entail breaking any of these five generally, engaging in behavior that goes against the five precepts? Now, if you haven't taken them as actual vows, you're not breaking the vows, but nonetheless, those five are still a nice guideline for the main things we want to avoid in any occupation. So then let's go to, where's I at? The third one. Okay. Finally, are there other aspects of my job that disturb me and keep my mind from settling down? Now, technically, this isn't where it becomes kind of wrong livelihood by nature in any way or what have you. Um, this is just, are there things that you do in your job that don't allow your mind then to settle so much that you are staying awake all night because of the stress and the difficulties you're having and working with others and so on? Those are the sorts of things you have to investigate yourself. There's no hard and fast rule on that. And some people may find that they can adjust things in their life so that their work life isn't as difficult and stressful as it was before. Other people may find that they need to extricate themselves from those situations because it's just not working for them to do those sorts of occupations. You know, um, I mean, I could imagine that if you really wanted to be somebody who lived a more kind of contemplative life of sorts, and you were a DJ in a dance hall for your occupation, and so you're there, with all that energy and sound and everything all around you, and then you go home and you try to meditate or try to, have some sort of a spiritual life. that could be problematic, right? So this is one just for you to investigate yourself. Is what you do somehow troubling your mind, disturbing your mind, so that it makes it difficult to engage in your Buddhist practice? You know? So anyway, this is something to think about. And I put these on here simply because, once more, I don't think we get enough of that kind of reinforcement of what is good livelihood, what is not ethical livelihood. Verse 7ab, the first two lines of this, I am putting out here an alternate translation by Alex Berzin because I really like this, what he referred this in this first line. I think in our text, it's material possessions, but he said, let me rid myself of all material burdens. It's a new way of looking at our material possessions, to see them as burdens, and adorn myself with an Arya's gems. We're going to talk about what these Arya gems are in a moment. But essentially, let me go back to our text and put that on the screen so that I can talk a little bit about that, and then we will go into these 7 Arya riches. So let's see. Whoops, that's not where I wanted to go. I wanted to go here. Okay. Forsake material possessions, embellish yourself with the wealth of the noble ones, avoid, oh, yeah, I'm sorry, let's just do the first two lines, sorry. Forsake material possessions and embellish yourself with the wealth of the noble ones. So what we're saying here is, I like again how Alex Berzin calls these material burdens. We have a lot of stuff in our lives that are just burdensome because we have to tend to them once more, take care of them, protect them, make sure that they don't disappear or diminish in their amount or whatever. Having a lot of material stuff can be problematic. Yeah. And so the main point for us as practitioners, though, is that we get distracted by all these sorts of things, and we put all of the energy into maintaining these material possessions to make sure that we have all of that in our lives, and we neglect tending to the inner riches that we need to deepen and develop. So this is the idea behind this 2 lines. Let's go back to the slides, and I've got, I think, one little quote on this at least. From Geshe Dargye, he says, thus we should abandon attachment for external ornaments, all these material things that we have, right, while retaining within us the gems, the jewels of a superior person. There are 7 of these inner gems to adorn our mind, named and explained at the conclusion of this text in verses 25 and 26 ABC, which are placed just after this verse in James B. Apple's translation. Remember last week I mentioned how I would be altering the order here and there, and this is one place where I'm altering the order because it makes sense to talk about these 7 now, and that, again, there must be some versions of the Tibetan or whatever that are with them in this order, because oftentimes 25 and 26 ABC are talked about here because these 7 gems are mentioned here. So let's go to those verses, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit more about them. I don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time on them, but nonetheless, I do want to discuss them a little bit. So let's go down. Sorry, this is making anyone dizzy. It's kind of making me dizzy. Verse 25, the wealth of faith, the wealth of morality, of giving, of learning, conscience, shame, insight. These are the 7 riches. So let me talk about these. I'll leave them on the screen for a minute. The wealth of faith, we talked about faith already earlier, right? Faith is an important part of our path. We can see it here as really this confidence that we need to have in the Buddha's teachings and in the Buddhist path. Hopefully we've gained that to some degree through what we have done in our own study and our practice meditation. Excuse me. Sorry about that. My throat's getting a little dry tonight for some reason. The second one, morality, we already talked about avoiding the 10 non-virtues and engaging in their opposites, and to engage in the Bodhisattva morality. That's obviously a very important thing. I think I'm going to need to do a throat spray. Just one second. I do have some stuff here that I use sometimes. I should have. Sorry about this. Okay, I'm back. So obviously, morality is something that we can See as something that we can adorn ourselves with in terms of our practice, something that will, again, be a wealth or a treasure that we have, a gem that we have ourselves. The third one is giving, generosity. Generosity is one of the 6 perfections of a bodhisattva, the very first one. And giving, obviously, is an important part of our practice, to give material things to others, to give protection to others, to even give the Dharma to others, to have that mind of generosity that is happy to share what we have with other beings. The wealth or treasure of learning. This is a gem we can adorn ourselves with. The more that we learn and engage in study and investigating the Buddha's teachings, the greater wealth that we have of that knowledge. Then the fourth one, or fifth one, conscience, and the sixth one, shame. Sometimes they're called embarrassment and shame. Let me take those off the screen because there's a lot of different names for these, and I actually like other names for these. Embarrassment, it's not a really, it's not one of my favorite words, and shame is even worse. But the idea behind them is that they are two things that kind of keep us in check. The first one, what he called, again, we often call embarrassment. He called it conscience. This is the idea that we want to be kind of considerate of others. We don't want to do things that are going to reflect badly on them or cause them to be bent out of shape or whatever the case might be. The other one that is called shame in our text, I often call this self respect, because self respect means that we are going to uphold good morality on the basis of our own standards of what we're holding ourselves to. So you can have kind of two aspects to why you would engage in good behavior. One is what other people may think of you, or think about your tradition, or think about your teachers on the basis of what you're doing. And then the other one is where you think about what you yourself would feel about what you're doing. That's a bit more of the conscience thing or whatever. That's why the translation doesn't make a lot of sense with me, conscience and, um, kind of shame or what have you, because again, I don't think these are exactly in line with the two that we normally talk about. I usually call them, again, consideration for others and then self-respect. The last one is in some texts called the wealth of insight. That's what it's referred to here. It is kind of the deeper knowledge, the deeper wisdom that we gain on the basis of our learning and study, where we actually have a more profound realization of the Dharma, especially of the nature of reality, emptiness. So again, these 7 are what we want to adorn ourselves with on the inside. There is a comment that's made by Geshe Dargye, I think, where he says essentially, when we talk about physical ornaments that we adorn the body with, you can only put so much on the body and then it becomes excessive, right? You can't walk out with like 5 pairs of earrings on and like 10, different glasses and whatever. It becomes ridiculous, right? But you can adorn yourself with all 7 of these riches to whatever degree, and you can accommodate it because they're internal. They're not something that kind of has that external limitations on it. So let me just share a few things and then we'll conclude for tonight. Just a few slides on these 7 riches of the Aryas. By the way, an Arya is a being who has had that direct realization of emptiness. That's why they have that wealth or gem of insight, the 7th one. Alex says, when we talk about a gem, we shouldn't just think of a jewel. Rather, we should think of a treasure that we build up more and more. They're never going to run out. They're kind of an inexhaustible treasure, nor can they be stolen. Again, no one can steal your mind of self-respect or your mind of generosity from you. You have those inside, and they will always be there. From the spiritual point of view, Geshe Dargye says, we are progressing well if we have the awakening mind as our friend and these 7 gems as our wealth, these treasures. Rinpoche, again, a Kadampa master, I believe, once requested his master Milarepa for permission to go to Lhasa in central Tibet. After Rinpoche departed, Milarepa was saddened. When asked why, he said, my moon-like disciple has gone away, and I, like a dog, stay behind. When he was further asked what wealth and companions were sent along with his disciple, Milarepa replied, I sent him away with the wealth of the 7 gems and the friend of the awakening mind. I have no worries about his safety now. So these are kind of our companions, the things that we do want to have with us all the time. are those 7 riches that we can cultivate internally. You can review those on your own. I'm sorry I went through them rather quickly tonight, but they are an important aspect of our path. And then we want to make sure that our best friend, of course, that we travel with is the mind of bodhicitta, the awakening mind. And this is the advice given in that first part of verse 7. So we are at the middle of verse 7. We'll carry on with the last 2 lines of verse 7 next week. Any questions or comments from tonight? Yes, Sheila, please.
So I was just wondering with the whole idea of like Robin Hood, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, where that kind of falls in this whole scenario.
um, Robin Hood probably should have lobbied for a better distribution of wages and wealth in the world. I mean, there is that tendency sometimes, and I will point out that there is like one story in the sutras of the Buddha as the Bodhisattva ship captain engaging in a non-virtuous action with a positive motivation. And I'll tell you about that one in a bit more. But in general, we can say that for us unenlightened beings, there are beings who are not so far in our wisdom and compassion that we can know things beyond what we are able to assess in our everyday understanding. We should avoid engaging in non virtuous actions with positive motivations because it's really tricky stuff to accomplish. The story of the ship captain is that, and you probably have heard it before, where in one of his prior lives, he was a great bodhisattva. He had these amazing clairvoyances and what have you, and he happened to be ferrying these 500 merchants to some land where they got all of these amazing goods, and they brought them all back on the ship. And on their way back, one of the 500 merchants was going to kill everyone else and take all the wealth for themselves. And I always wonder, well, why didn't the Buddha or as the ship captain just tie up this one man? But nonetheless, the story goes that he had to take his life. But he took his life not just out of compassion for the 499 other merchants that were going to be killed, but out of compassion for that man who was going to take the lives of 499 other beings and have to experience incredible suffering. So there's that one story, and I've not located another one, but essentially, he had an amazing compassionate motivation where he was able to see the suffering of the being who was going to be the perpetrator as well as the suffering of the victims, and knew that it was best to intervene and take that karma on himself rather than that being having to face the effects of that karma of killing all those beings. So again, when we start talking about doing things for a greater goal or for something that makes more sense, such as robbing from the rich to give to the poor, redistributing wealth in your own way, well, you're engaging in a non-virtuous action of taking resources that are not offered to you. And you are probably lacking compassion for the person who got those resources. I mean, it's kind of sad to say, but this is the reality of how karma works, right? People do not have the resources they have, such as these, billionaires in our world and so on, without having created the causes for that. That is their karma to have that, work out in terms of them get money that is seeming to be so astronomically above what they're worth, but they have that karma to be able to have that result. And we are wanting to interfere with that karma, take away from them what they have and give it to someone else. And so there can be, again, more judicious ways about going about doing that, where we do things through our government and whatever, and try to find a more equal distribution of things to benefit those who don't have and what have you. But sometimes we do those things and it doesn't even work to the benefit of people, right? Because it's very difficult to do that. But that's much better than overtly taking from people and giving it to someone else. Your motivation might be good, but that's that whole thing of like the ends justifying the means. And the Buddha never taught that as like a valid way of going about living one's life. We should do whatever we can within the functioning of karma to try to help beings and to not harm them. And so we should be respecting those laws of karma while we are working on these various things in our world of having less poverty, less hunger, and famine and all the various things. Look at what's going on in our world. Again, unbelievable suffering. Doesn't mean we wash our hands of it and go, oh, that's their karma. They just have to deal with it. Rather, we say, what can we do in a more structured, legal, and not mm, overtly non-virtuous way to rectify things. It's the only way that we are going to keep it karmically clean. Unless you're a high level bodhisattva and you really have the ability to generate this amazing compassion for both the person who has all the money and the people who don't have the money, and then maybe you can somehow get it as a clear action. But for most of us, pretty difficult to do. Lama Zopa Rinpoche said that in that instance of the Bodhisattva ship captain, that he actually created virtue by killing that being because of his strong, compassionate motivation for that being to not engage in all of that killing. So I think it's not an identical example of the wealthy person and stealing from them to give to those who don't have, but nonetheless, it's similar in terms of a non-virtuous action that we would want to avoid and try to do things in a more, again, structured way where we have something to support it rather than just us going in and grabbing things from people. I don't know. That's my understanding of it on the basis of the teachings of the Buddha, that he never really, other than that one example, showed that somebody engaging in a non-virtuous action, because stealing by its nature is non-virtuous, regardless of what we're stealing for. Uh, but it can be transmuted if one's motivation is extremely pure. So every time I say that, I just emphasize that. Don't think that it's carte blanche then to go around and take the lives of various figures in our world who you think are doing harm to beings and what have you, because you think that that's a good action to do. Do you have as much compassion for them who are engaging in these actions as you do for the people who are being harmed by them? That's the test. Maybe even more compassion. Maybe you see again that the incredible negative karma that some people in our world are creating is going to come home to roost. They are going to have to face the suffering of that. But you have to be able to have that level of compassion to make it into a virtuous act. So it's pretty tough to get to that place where stealing from the rich to give to the poor, or taking the life of somebody who's harming others, is a karmically positive action. Does that help?
So your motivation doesn't sort of mitigate the non-virtuous action.
Well, it does in the end. That was kind of, yeah. If the motivation is that strong that you have compassion for the perpetrator, more so even than the people who are going to be harmed, because you see the incredible suffering they're going to have to engage in, well, then you might have some, again, mitigation of the results of that. And as Rinpoche said, you could even make it into a virtuous action. But I think we have to be really careful. I know I don't have that level of mind where I have this incredible compassion for anyone who's engaged in this type of stuff in our world, to think that I can be the one to rectify that and make it into a virtuous action. The one thing I'll point out too is it said that when he did that, when the Buddha, as that Bodhisattva ship captain, took the life of that man, he had the complete willingness as well to take on whatever negative karma would accrue and the result from that. So he wasn't about to, just do it with no understanding of the negative consequences of that. He was willing and said, perfectly fine, I will take on all the karma, all the results that man would have accrued through these 499 killings on myself, even if I have to, because I want to benefit that being. That's a little bit of that mind of Tonglen that we touched on a little bit last week, and that is a key part of our Lojong practice, the willingness to take on the suffering of others, to take on the karma of others. When we see people doing things in the world, how often do we say, God, I'm glad I don't have their karma? Do we ever think, oh, I would willingly take on their suffering so they wouldn't have to experience it? No, we kind of think, oh, I'm glad they're going to get theirs at some point. So we can see how our minds don't have very pure motivation in a lot of these things. So we have to be really careful. So those are my thoughts on that. I don't know that I have perfect understanding of it, but I think I can base what I said again on things I've heard from Rinpoche, as well as what's taught around that particular story. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sheila, for that question. We should probably conclude. So if you do have some questions, you can send them on to Sheila, or whoever there you're in contact with, Pat. and they will pass them along to me, or you can bring them to class next week, and I will answer them then. Hopefully have time for it. Sorry, I ended up speaking a lot of the class. Let's do the prayers that are on the screen together to dedicate the merit. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may we quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then this wonderful prayer for bodhicitta to deepen and develop in our hearts. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. And then let's do the long life prayer for His Holiness, where we make a strong thought of his good health, his long life to accrue for him, as well as for all of his holy wishes to be fulfilled. And we can think about that in regard to all of our other teachers. The wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then we won't recite the whole prayer for Rinpoche tonight, but we'll, since we're running a little late, but let's just have some thoughts of dedicating for the very swift return of Rinpoche in terms of his reincarnation being identified very quickly, and then everything being auspicious for him to be able to become of great benefit to us and others in this world. Lastly, we dedicate for all the beings that we're holding in our hearts. Whoever it is that we know or are thinking of who are experiencing difficulties at this time, we dedicate for their freedom from those, freedom from all suffering, and that they might find all the causes that lead to true peace and happiness. And may all beings have freedom from suffering and true peace through what we have done here together tonight. Thank you all for joining again tonight. Sorry about my throat getting dry here. I don't know. There's allergies that are going on here still. We just had some rain, so I think I'm just picking up on something that's out there, but hopefully it'll be better in the weeks to come. Everyone have a good week. Try to work with these sayings if you can, review them to some degree over the next week, and then we'll continue adding more of these jewels in our garland of advice from Lama Atisha next week. All right, be well. Thank you again, Pat and Sheila, for hosting.
Thank you, Don.
All your work there.
Thank you.
Okay.
See you all next week.
All right. Bye-bye.